In January 1848, a man stood beside a half-built sawmill and watched sunlight dance across a river. His name was James Wilson Marshall, and the tiny shimmer he noticed that morning would ignite one of the greatest migrations in human history. He bent down, scooped up a few pebbles, and saw something flash between them. Bright yellow, stubbornly shining even underwater. He bit it, hammered it, and felt the weight. Gold. Marshall didn't shout. He didn't celebrate. He simply pocketed the flakes, walked to his employer, John Sutter, and said quietly, "I think I found something." Neither of them knew that discovery would reshape America forever. At the time, California was little more than a frontier. The U.S. had just claimed it from Mexico, and fewer than 15,000 settlers lived in the entire region. There were no real towns, no railroads, no laws, just dirt, dreams, and distance. Marshall was a craftsman, not a prospector. He'd come west looking for work, not treasure. But destiny rarely asks for permission. Word spread slowly at first. A few whispers in taverns. A merchant bragging to the wrong customer. By spring, the rumor reached San Francisco. Gold in the hills, free for the taking. Within months, ships emptied, factories closed, and farms were abandoned as people flooded west. The newspapers started calling them the 49ers, named for the year the madness peaked. 1849. Some came by sea around Cape Horn, a journey that could take half a year. Others risked disease and starvation crossing the continent by wagon. They came from New York, Chile, China, France, and Peru. It was the first truly global gold rush. When they arrived, the hills were already alive with noise. Shovels clanging, men shouting, water rushing through makeshift channels. It looked like chaos, but to them, it sounded like opportunity. The work. The first miners used pans, kneeling in freezing streams from dawn until dusk. They'd scoop gravel and swirl it gently underwater, washing away the dirt until maybe a few glittering flakes remained. It was slow, back-breaking labor. On a good day, a skilled panner might earn $1 or $2 in gold, barely enough to buy supplies. But innovation followed desperation. Soon, they built rockers, wooden boxes mounted on curved runners, which they rocked back and forth while pouring water through them. The heavier gold settled into small grooves at the bottom. A two-man team could process 10 times more dirt than with a simple pan. Next came sluices. Long wooden troughs lined with metal riffles and blankets. Streams were diverted through them, and entire hillsides were shoveled in. Gold dust clung to the traps while the waste flowed away. The technology kept scaling up. What began as quiet panning turned into industrial warfare against the earth. By the early 1850s, companies used hydraulic cannons, blasting cliffs apart with torrents of high-pressure water. Entire valleys vanished. Rivers ran thick with mud. It was efficient, destructive, and completely unstoppable. Yet every man with a shovel believed he was one strike away from freedom. That's what made the gold rush so powerful. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about hope. A nation transformed. In 1848, San Francisco was a sleepy port town of fewer than 1,000 residents. By 1852, it had over 35,000. Tents turned into taverns, taverns into banks. Ships anchored in the harbor were stripped of masts and converted into floating hotels, warehouses, and jails. California became a magnet for ambition. Every language, every religion, every class collided in those muddy streets. A barber from France might share a tent with a farmer from Ohio and a sailor from Shanghai. They all dreamed of the same thing, striking it rich. But the people who really profited weren't the miners, they were the merchants. A man named Samuel Brannan, for example, bought every shovel and pan he could find before announcing the discovery of gold in his newspaper. When miners came flooding in, he sold the tools at enormous markups, becoming California's first millionaire. And a Bavarian tailor named Levi Strauss found fortune not in dust, but in denim. He designed durable pants for miners, clothes that would last longer than their dreams. More than a century later, his name would still be stitched into American history. Meanwhile, the man who started it all, James Marshall, was losing everything. The irony of discovery. Marshall had no legal claim to the land where he found gold. It belonged to Sutter, and even he couldn't protect it once the crowds arrived. Thousands of fortune seekers stormed their property, tearing down fences, stealing cattle, even stripping the mill for parts. Marshall tried to stake nearby claims, but chaos ruled. California wasn't yet a state, and there were no courts or sheriffs to enforce property rights. When the government finally caught up, the easy gold was gone. And so was Marshall's chance at wealth. He tried farming. He tried running a vineyard. He even gave lectures about his discovery, hoping the fame might pay his bills. Nothing worked. While others built empires from his spark, Marshall drifted deeper into poverty. He'd given the world its biggest treasure hunt, and all it gave him back was a memory. Yet history rarely rewards its catalysts. The gold rush wasn't about fairness, it was about momentum, and America was moving faster than ever before. The economic explosion. Between 1848 and 1855, miners pulled more than 12 million ounces of gold from California soil. At the time, it was worth roughly $250 million. Today, around $24 billion, that flood of wealth didn't stay in California. It poured into banks, fueled construction, and stabilized the young nation's economy. New branches of the U.S. Mint opened to handle the influx. Railroads and telegraph lines spread across the continent. The gold rush transformed America from a scattered collection of states into a connected, industrial power. It also changed how people thought about success. Before, wealth came from land and labor. Now, it came from risk. The rush made speculation a virtue. It taught a generation that fortune favored the bold, and that luck was something you made with your own hands. The United States had found its defining myth, the American dream. The world rushes, and the promise of gold spread faster than any law could follow. By 1849, nearly every harbor on the Pacific was clogged with ships whose crews had abandoned them to dig in the hills. San Francisco's shoreline became a graveyard of masts, vessels stripped and turned into shops, hotels, even prisons. From every direction, the world converged on California. Latin American miners from Chile and Peru brought seasoned techniques, using wooden sluices and mercury to capture fine dust. Chinese workers, among the most disciplined, arrived by the thousands, forming tight communities that built roads and gardens in the barren camps. Europeans came armed with engineering know-how. Americans came armed with faith that they could rewrite their lives. They all shared one belief. Somewhere in the mud waited a miracle. The rhythm of the camps. Each morning began before sunrise. Men woke stiff and sore, their boots frozen from river water, their lungs full of dust. They'd light fires, boil coffee, and march back to the diggings with shovels slung like rifles. The work was relentless. 10, sometimes 12 hours bent over pans, shovels, and sluices. Some struck a pocket of pure gold and became rich overnight. Others spent months chasing a rumor and died broke. Luck, not effort, seemed to rule everything. At night, the hills glowed with campfires. Fiddles played, cards slapped against makeshift tables, whiskey bottles made their rounds. There were fights, friendships, weddings, and murders, often in the same week. Law was whatever the miners agreed it should be. They held miners' courts, electing judges on the spot to settle claim disputes or punish thieves. Justice could be fair, or fatal, depending on who shouted loudest. And through it all, the dirt kept giving. Not to everyone, but enough to keep the dream alive. The technology race necessity became invention. Simple pans gave way to long toms, then to massive sluices powered by diverted streams. By the early 1850s, the next revolution hit: hydraulic mining. Engineers built iron nozzles, called monitors, that fired water with enough force to carve canyons. Whole hillsides collapsed under the blasts. What had been a prospector's camp now looked like a battlefield. Hydraulic mining multiplied production by hundreds, feeding stamp mills that crushed quartz rock into dust for chemical extraction. The scale was astonishing, and so was the destruction. Rivers turned gray, farmland drowned in silt, and forests vanished for lumber. To the companies running the operations, this was progress. To the farmers downstream, it was ruin. To James Marshall, it was heartbreaking. He had discovered gold by accident, chasing wood for a mill, not power for an empire. Now he watched mountains vanish in the name of his discovery. Still, he understood why they did it. Gold wasn't just metal anymore. It was momentum. It was America, learning how to industrialize itself. The human cost. In the pursuit of fortune, few noticed what the rush erased. Native Californian tribes who had lived in the valleys for centuries were driven off their lands. Some were enslaved to dig for miners. Others died from disease or violence. The state's population of indigenous people fell by more than half within a decade. Chinese workers faced brutal taxes and racism, but kept the camps running with quiet resilience. Free black pioneers, many escaping slavery, mined successfully, and even opened businesses, though their rights vanished again when California joined the Union as a free state that still tolerated prejudice. The gold rush promised equality, but practiced hierarchy. It offered freedom, but often delivered fatigue. And yet, for millions watching from afar, California became proof that destiny could be seized, if you were brave enough to try. Boomtowns and broken dreams. Every goldfield birthed a boomtown. A trickle of tents would swell into a city almost overnight. Saloons lined muddy streets. Gamblers and barkeepers made more money than most miners ever would. When the gold ran out, the population scattered, leaving behind ghost towns with names like Hangtown and Deadwood, eerie testaments to temporary glory. Still, some places endured. Sacramento became the state's capital. Stockton and San Francisco turned into hubs of trade and finance. What began as chaos hardened into civilization. Merchants who sold supplies grew into tycoons. Bankers financed new mines. The first railways and telegraph lines tied the Pacific to the Atlantic. California wasn't a frontier anymore. It was the economic engine of a young nation. James Marshall's fading light. While the country prospered, Marshall slipped quietly into obscurity. He never profited from his discovery. His sawmill rotted, his claims were stolen, and his fame turned to ridicule. Reporters visited him decades later expecting wealth, and found a gray-haired man living in a cabin, surviving on a small state pension. He spent his days carving souvenirs out of wood, pointing to the spot where history began. He told visitors the same story over and over, how he found the first flakes of gold, how everything changed, and how he never saw a penny of it. Some laughed, some pitied him, but Marshall himself seemed at peace. He'd once said, "I never thought what it was going to do. I only knew it was gold." A nation forged in ambition. The numbers were staggering. From 1848 to 1855, miners extracted roughly 12 million ounces of gold, more than any single region in the world at that time. The metal fueled the creation of banks, funded infrastructure, and tripled the U.S. money supply. Gold from California built the railroads that united East and West. It underwrote the factories that would later arm the Union during the Civil War. It filled treasuries from Washington, D.C. to London, reshaping the global economy. America's identity shifted. It was no longer a land defined by scarcity and survival, but by ambition. The gold rush taught Americans to believe in sudden transformation, that one bold discovery could change everything. That belief would echo through every boom that followed: oil, steel, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, crypto. All of it traced back to that glint in the river. The echo of gold. By the time the rush faded, California was unrecognizable. The tents had hardened into cities. The wagon tracks had become roads. A territory that once seemed unreachable was now the beating heart of a nation. The gold was mostly gone, but the people stayed. They built farms, factories, and families. They built California. And in doing so, they built the United States we know today. The wealth pulled from those hills didn't just fill pockets, it financed progress. It paid for the railroads that stitched the continent together, for telegraph lines that carried news at the speed of lightning, for ships that circled the globe with the American flag on their masts. The gold rush gave the country its first taste of global power. But its greatest treasure wasn't the metal. It was the mindset. The miners learned that fortune came to those who tried, failed, and tried again. That lesson spread faster than any rumor of nuggets in a stream. It became the rhythm of a young nation that refused to stand still. The world watched as America transformed, from a quiet republic to a restless powerhouse driven by invention and ambition. And behind that transformation, buried beneath layers of history, was the ghost of a carpenter named James Marshall. He lived long enough to see the nation he'd accidentally set in motion. He watched trains thunder where wagons once crawled. He saw banks rise in towns that didn't exist when he was young. Sometimes he smiled at the noise. Other times, he just listened to the river that had changed everything. When he died in 1885, California built him a monument on the hill above Coloma. A bronze statue of a man pointing toward the water, forever showing the world where it all began. Beneath it, an inscription: "Eureka, I have found it." He hadn't found wealth. He'd found something bigger. Proof that one small act could rewrite a nation's story. More than a century later, that story still echoes. Every new boom, oil in Texas, steel in Pittsburgh, tech in Silicon Valley, follows the same rhythm as the gold rush: discovery, dream, destruction, reinvention. The tools have changed, but the hunger is the same. When engineers code in garages or traders chase the next digital fortune, they're following the trail Marshall started. The rivers are gone, replaced by screens and servers, but the sparkle is familiar. It's the same promise. Maybe this is the one that changes everything. The gold rush built more than cities. It built the American habit of believing that the next great idea might be hiding in plain sight. That optimism drove settlers west, scientists upward, and entrepreneurs online. It created a culture that celebrates the gamble and forgives the fall. Of course, the shadows never left. For every winner, there were thousands who lost. The land paid a price. So did the people erased from it. Progress has always carried both creation and cost. But the legacy of that fever, the energy, the ambition, the refusal to give up, still fuels the country's pulse. Look around. The skyscrapers, the stock exchanges, the endless hum of invention. All of it, in some quiet way, traces back to that riverbank in 1848. To the moment a tired carpenter bent down and picked up possibility. James Marshall never knew what he'd started. He couldn't have imagined the empires, the highways, the satellites, or the smartphones. He just saw something shining in the dirt and chose to believe it mattered. That's what the gold rush really was. Not a story about wealth, but about belief. Belief that the world can change overnight. Belief that ordinary people can shape extraordinary outcomes. Belief that even in chaos, there's a glimmer of something worth chasing. And that belief became America. So when you hear about fortunes made in code or rockets or digital coins, remember the man by the river. He didn't find gold for himself. He found a spark for everyone else. The gold rush ended more than 150 years ago, but its fire never went out. It still burns in every dreamer who looks at an impossible goal and whispers the same word James Marshall did when he saw that flicker in the water. Eureka. Thanks for watching. If you love stories of money, power, and ambition, hit subscribe to Aznar Wealth, where every fortune has a story, and every story inspires the next one.